So here we go with our final commandment, number 10 in our series of Tuning Up to 10. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. You shalt not covet your neighbor's spouse. You shalt not covet the ox or donkey or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. So here we go, and let us pray. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our light. Amen. This week, a unique auction was held, and you may have heard about it. It was an auction for a seat into space. Jeff Bezos, the multi-billionaire founder and CEO, at least CEO for a few more months of Amazon, is blasting into space in his private space capsule in July, and he had an extra seat up for offer. So he put it up for auction. The winning bid was $28 million. The flight will take 11 minutes, meaning the cost of flying into space with the founder of Amazon is over $2.5 million per minute. We don't know who the lucky person is. Again, this is Thursday. Maybe by Sunday we do know, but we don't know what his or her name is. It hasn't been announced yet. Well, it got me thinking about the question, what is the real value of a trip like that? I mean, as cool as it is to go into space, isn't an also cool part of that deal having 11 minutes of Jeff Bezos' attention? Boy, the questions I would ask about retirement funds and good investments and where to find a really good steak dinner. Then again, if I had $28 million, I probably wouldn't need to ask those questions. And let's face it, he's going to be probably driving the spacecraft and wouldn't want to be distracted with all of my questions either. But anyway, when I heard this news, I don't mind admitting that for an hour or two, my mind wandered as I thought about what it would be like to go into space, even for 11 minutes. And I realized that at this point in my life, that's probably a goal I'm never going to obtain. But for the record, my birthday is January 29th, and if you're thinking, I really need to feel something this year, well, there's a hint. And so we get to our last commandment, thou shalt not covet. Or simply, thou shalt not want what someone else has, including a $28 million seat into space. So before we get into this commandment, let me ask you a general question as we're pretty much now at the end of the line, the end of the 10. And by the way, I hope you've all enjoyed this series as much as I have. I don't think I've ever enjoyed a series so much of looking into and researching these commandments. I learned a great deal myself. I hope you learned a couple of things as well. Anyway, we're at the end, so let's take a moment to assess. How have you done with the commandments so far? Are you batting at least 500? Are you getting at least half of them right on a regular basis? I'm quite sure you are. I'm wondering if you may be even batting 1,000. Perfect. Worship only one God. I'm pretty sure that's an easy one to get right. I doubt too many people are worshiping false idols. Are you using God's name in vain? Well, one of the least lost, if you let a word slip out, we can let that one go. Honoring your parents? How's that one going? Keep the Sabbath holy? Well, you're watching this. That's a good start of definitely keeping that one as well. What about the big ones? Killing, adultery, and stealing. So far, so good? Admittedly, last week was a tough one. Bearing false witness. That one may have been your speed bump because it is hard not to lie. Although, if you take the commandment literally and you've avoided a court of law, then I'm pretty sure you've kept that one as well. So how have you done? Does anyone have 9 out of 9? If you do, that's amazing. Give yourself a pat on the back. You would have thrived back in the day. No one would have wanted to have stoned you to death. But I'm afraid if you got 9 out of 9 and are feeling on top of the world and you see perfection on the horizon, your streak comes to an end today. No one keeps the 10th commandment, and I mean no one. It just doesn't happen. I don't care if you are as saintly as Phyllis Burwell. That's an inside joke for those of us who go to Northwest. I don't care how saintly you are. You break the 10th commandment. Probably routinely. Because not one of us, doesn't peer over the fence of life from time to time to check out what's going on in our neighbor's backyard and wonder if their grass isn't a little greener than ours. And don't tell me you don't, because then you're breaking the 9th commandment, and then from there it's a slippery slope, and soon you're going to be worshiping little golden calves. So, thou shalt not covet. Unfortunately, yes, you shalt, and you can't convince me otherwise. Don't tell me you haven't looked twice at your neighbor's boat, sitting larger than life in their driveway, and pictured yourself sailing around Kempenfelt Bay on a beautiful summer's day. Don't tell me you haven't wondered what it's like to watch the European Soccer Championships on a 64-inch screen with surround sound TV, the one that your lazy brother-in-law has, despite the fact that he never seems to be working. Don't tell me you haven't wondered what your best friend's hat or shoes or Lululemon running gear would look like on you. Don't tell me you haven't looked at your significant other and wondered what it would be like to be Mrs. Brad Pitt. Too far with the last one? Maybe. Sorry. It's human nature to want what we don't have. It's human nature to think of yourself in a passing moment, how come I don't get to have $28 million to blast into space? We all covet. The founder of Chick-fil-A, I think that's how you say it, which is a fast food chicken place in the U.S., kind of like Kentucky Fried Chicken, is someone who's very open about his Christian faith. And when he first started it, he used to have a sign outside his first store. And on the sign it said, "Remember to keep the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox." And underneath he wrote, "So eat more chicken." The word covet literally means to have a strong desire. And what makes the 10th commandment such a difficult one for people to follow is that it deals with those things, with desires, with our inner impulses rather than our outer actions. It deals with the part of ourselves that we really can't control, or at least not as well. It deals with our thoughts. Likely, we would never steal a watch that we saw on the counter at a store, but it doesn't stop us from thinking about how much we'd like that watch or what it would look like on our wrist. We're never going to kill someone, but how many of us have ever been thrown into a fit of rage when cut off by a driver on the 400 and thought, boy, if I could get my hands on that person? Most of us can control our actions just fine. But this commandment is inviting us or asking us to consider the impulses, the thoughts, and the ideas behind our actions. And that's an entirely different ballgame. That's a very hard, if not impossible, thing to do. How do we control our thoughts? How do we stop ourselves from imagining ourselves on our neighbor's boat? Or how do we stop ourselves from feeling jealous at our friend's adventurous life when we just seem to have a regular old mundane life? I have no doubt that there are some very well-disciplined religious folks of all different faith practices who have found a way to control their innermost thoughts. But I'm sure that they are also few and far between. I knew a guy in theology school who actually used to have an elastic band on his wrist. And every time he had a thought or an impulse that he didn't think was worthy of him, he would snap the elastic band on his wrist, which would hurt. He believed he could train his mind by associating his thoughts with pain. Honestly, and I know this sounds a little judgmental, so forgive me, but he kind of stressed me out. Because every so often I'd be sitting in class and all of a sudden I'd hear a snap of the elastic band and I'd wonder what unworthy thought he was having in his head. I remember once we were sitting in class and there was a luncheon in the classroom next door, and this amazing smell of food wafted into the room, and just enjoying the smell when all of a sudden I heard snap. And I thought, why is he having an unworthy thought about the food that he can smell? And then I wondered if it was just some weird experiment and he was trying to train all of us around him, that we were the dogs in his Pavlovian experiment. So I moved desks. I always kind of wondered if he ever became a minister and is snapping away in a pulpit somewhere. You know what, I joked, that was his thing, and it worked for him, and more power to him. But I think that's why I have kind of a love-hate relationship when it comes to the 10th commandment. I understand that thoughts are powerful, and thoughts provide the first step that lead to actions, which lead to outcomes. Some are good, and some not so good. I know that they are powerful things, and thus there is value in mental discipline, in seeking to master our thoughts, and thus have more control over our actions. Jesus likened mental discipline to washing dishes. He said once, "Why do you clean the outside of the cup, but leave the inside of the cup dirty and stained? You should wash the inside of the cup first." He was talking about our inner life, our thoughts. Although to be absolutely clear, what he was really talking about in that sentence was religious hypocrisy, pointing out those who like to come across as pious and perfect, nice suit, nice shoes, nice hairdo, but inside their intentions might be unkind or unethical. The idea of the wolf in sheep's clothing. He was reminding them that the faithful life isn't about looking perfect. It's about acting with love and integrity. And acting from love and integrity begins with the thoughts that we have. Take care of the inside rather than the outside. It's good advice. So as much as I understand the goal of disciplining our minds and our thoughts as much as we can, it could also become kind of an unhealthy obsession, as in snap. Because it can be a recipe for a certain amount of guilt and shame. We already carry enough of that stuff around with us that we don't need to beat ourselves up for admiring our neighbor's boat or admiring their garden and wishing we had a garden like that. To me, these are perfectly normal thoughts, perfectly normal impulses that come from being aware of the world around us. And not only that, but could we not almost say or also say that there could be a bright side in noticing what other people have? It can actually be motivating. If everyone's lawn on the street is green and pristine and yours is a mess of weeds and dandelions, you can sit there looking around at everybody's and saying the grass is greener there and feeling badly about yourself. Or it could motivate you to go to Home Hardware and get one of those little thingies that can help you get your dandelions out of your grass. Don't get me wrong. I'm not championing the idea of coveting, as you're going to see in a minute. If you're spending all your days feeling sorry for yourself about what you don't have, or your mind is constantly filled with thoughts such as, everyone is better off than me, then yes, that is not a good or a healthy place from which to live your life. That is no way to live your life. And can I just share this editorial comment? If there's one thing that 25 years of ministry has taught me, it is this: don't judge people for what you see. Not all is gold that looks like gold. Just as not all is coal that looks like coal. You just never know what's really going on in people's lives. That's the danger of coveting. Sometimes getting it wrong. Feeling miserable all the time, that everyone is better off when it may or may not actually be true. But if you have a genuine desire for self-improvement or personal achievement, and seeing what others have motivates you, and I'm not just talking about stuff, but things that they've achieved or hobbies that they have or interests that they're pursuing, and you'd like to bring some of those things in your life, then maybe there's a benefit to it, in my own opinion. So, with respect to the Bible, I'm not jumping on board with the snapping idea. I don't think it's ultimately achievable, and I don't think it's always healthy to deny our thoughts or to attack ourselves when we think something unworthy of us. We all do it. It's human nature. But don't get me wrong. I still see this as a valuable commandment. In fact, maybe the most valuable commandment. And I'm going to honor this commandment because it does actually point to something better and can remind us of a great life lesson as we wrap up this series on the 10 Commandments. But first, let me say this. I've made the point throughout this series that what all of these commandments have in common is that they all came with the price of capital punishment if you broke them. And I've said that because, again, I want everyone to realize that these commandments came from a particular time in history, particular context, and that's why we have to be really careful as to how we apply them today. And a lot of people, when I said that, wrote in emails and sent me emails saying that they never realized this. And one person sent me one, and they said, well, you know what, I get it. I get that killing might be a capital crime, or worshiping false idols, or even breaking the Sabbath in those tribal days. But this person said, how can you take someone's life for simply desiring what someone else has? How can thou shalt not covet be a capital crime? It's complicated, but my understanding is this. The capital crime in thou shalt not covet, was for something specific. Remember at the time that the Israelites were one of the very few monotheistic cultures in the world, meaning that they believed in one God. Most of the tribal cultures in that day believed in many gods. They were polytheistic. So when Israelite soldiers would go to war against another empire or against another tribe of people and therefore conquer them, the first thing that they would do is gather up all the idols to their gods, and they would destroy them because they were an affront to the one true God that they believed of Israel. What would happen, however, is that soldiers would desire the gold and silver from the gathered up idols. And why wouldn't they? They had meager salaries. A little gold or silver from a golden calf that they got could feed their families for weeks. And so they would sometimes take it. But to do so was believed to bring the negative energy of those foreign gods into the community, which in turn would upset God, whose wrath the Israelites feared. Hence, anyone caught coveting the gold or silver or plundered idols was convicted of a capital crime. So no, you weren't stoned to death because you told the high priest that you liked his sandals better than yours. But if you were caught looting around the pile of gold calves in the warehouse out back, then it might not turn out quite so well. Okay, so let's get back on track here. What can we take from this commandment? Well, let me share with you what I believe is the ultimate negative side of coveting. This is nothing life-changing that I'm going to share. This is something that we all know, but I'm going to say it anyway. The worst outcome of coveting, desiring what others have, is that you could be so busy peering over the fence of your neighbor into their yard, you could be missing out or sacrificing what's going on in your own yard. Coveting could be distracting you from making the most of what you have. You ever heard of the old fable or tale of the dog who lived in the valley? The dog lived in a valley. And at the top of the valley was a farm over here, and the top of the other side of the valley was another farm. And every time it was a meal time in the farms, the farmer would ring the bell so that the people in the fields could come in and get their food. The dog living in the bottom of the valley would hear the bell ring and would want to get scraps, and so it would begin to run up the valley to get to the house. And then just before it got to the house, the bell would ring on the other house, the other side of the valley. The dog would turn around and run back up to that, and then they would hear the bell over here, and down he would go. Well, in the story, the dog ends up dying from starvation. He was so busy following the lure of the bell, he never got the experience to enjoy the feast. He was so busy following the lure of the bell, he never got to enjoy the feast. The opposite of thou shalt not covet is thou shalt be content. Contented is without question one of life's greatest, if most elusive, treasures. When you have it, you know that you have a treasure. The contented person doesn't need to look over their neighbor's fence because he or she has enough to occupy them in their own backyard. The contented person doesn't waste time wondering what it will be like to sail on their neighbor's $1 million boat because they are out for a walk along the beautiful waterfront in their $25 flip-flops. The contented person isn't trying to fly into outer space because they are exploring their own inner space, where there can be just as much of an adventure taking place. Let me put onto the screen a couple of my favorite contentment quotes. The first is by the great thinker and philosopher Lao Tzu. This is what he said: "Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you." And the second one I want to show you is by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, who put it this way: "For after all, the best thing one can do when it is raining is let it rain." Now, it's easy for me to come across as being very preachy on this point, so I want to be very honest about something. Of all the commandments, this is the one that I struggle with the most, by a long shot. This is my speed bump. When God was handing out the gift of the contented spirit, I was in the wrong line, and I instead got the gift of a restless spirit. I think I may have seen some of you in that line as well. Over time, I've learned to make friends with my restlessness, recognizing that it has pushed me to do some wonderful things in my life that I may otherwise never have done. But I don't mind admitting, especially as I get older, that I would like to trade it in to just find a little more contentment. Because as you get older, it's harder to keep running back and forth from one house to the next, following the sound of the bell. Maybe some of you know that struggle only too well. Do you know what drives a discontented life? It's the same thing that drives almost all of our more primal impulses or feelings, and it's fear. In this case, it's the fear of missing out. The fear that somehow we will not experience all that we need to experience or do all that we need to do. So we look over this fence, and we look over that fence, and we look at that grass, and we look down at our own grass, and we scratch our heads, and we hear this bell, and we hear the other bell, and we're running, trying to find it all. Guess what the irony is? In trying to follow all that, we lose touch with the very gifts of our own life. In trying to find contentment elsewhere, we lose touch with the ability to find contentment right where we are. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's even more than that. Here's the irony about the 10th commandment: "Thou shalt not covet." It is the last on the list, and therefore you could assume at first glance that maybe it's the least important. In fact, the argument could be made, should be made, that it's actually the most important of all 10. In fact, this commandment should be the one in the driver's seat. What do you think leads to murder, adultery, stealing, disrespect, fascination with worldly idols? Fear and discontent. You could make the case that if we get the 10th commandment right, the others will all naturally fall into place. Because when you are contented, the bell loses its allure. So how do we find contentment? Here is the sum total of my wisdom. I don't know how you find contentment. It's your journey. And what makes you content is probably very different than what makes me content. All I can do is answer for myself, for my own journey or attempt to find contentment. To me, it comes down to one belief and one action. The belief is being willing to swap out fear for faith. Fear says, I'm never enough. Faith says, I am completely enough. Again, as Lao Tzu said it so well, be content with what you have, rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. That's exactly what Jesus was talking about when he said to his followers, why do you fear? Look at the birds and the flowers and think that if God cares for them, how much more value must God have for you? In other words, stop looking at the green grass next door and try looking at the birds and flowers in your own yard. Contentment is swapping out fear for faith. The belief that your value is not in your boat, your Lululemon clothes, or your $28 million seat in space. Your value is in something much deeper, much more precious. It is your essential sacredness as a child or a creation of God, a creation of love. When you can say to yourself, I am enough, not because of what I have, but because of who I am, the world is yours. But I think belief is only half of it. The other is action. And to me, it is this simple. If you want to make your grass greener, can I suggest, why not try watering it? What I mean by that is invest fully, deeply, and completely in the people that you love, in the passions that you have, in the hobbies that fire you up, in the goals that you aspire to, in the changes you wish to see, in the simple pleasures of love and laughter and life. If you are so busy watering your own lawn, you're not going to worry for 1 second about what's going on in your neighbors because you have your hands and your heart full just where you are. Swap your fear for faith and water your own lawn. That's my recipe for trying to seek contentment in my life. Anyway, let me try and wrap this up today with a really beautiful little French fable. There was once a cobbler who was a happy and contented man. People who passed his shop laughed and waved when they saw him singing at the top of his voice while he was fixing shoes. Many people stopped in his shop just to bask in the warmth of his smile. One of the people who observed the cobbler was a banker who sang little and smiled less. He seldom slept well. At first he was irritated by the constant good humor of the cobbler. But as the days passed, he was attracted to the man's joy. Finally, he decided to visit the cobbler and discover the secret of his happiness. After the two men chatted for a while, the banker inquired, "Are you wealthy? Pardon me for asking, but how much money do you make each year?" "Well, my family is seldom in want," the cobbler answered. "Some days I only fix shoes and no one buys. The shop is closed on holy days, so there's no income on those days. I simply cannot give you an accurate sum." "How wonderfully simple," the banker said. "Well, I have decided to eliminate your financial problems for the immediate future, since you have so openly shared your life story with me. Take this gift of 300 gold coins and use them whenever you have need." Overjoyed, the cobbler quickly went home and buried the gold in the corner of his house. The succeeding days brought many changes. He often left the shop to go home when his family was absent, thinking someone might come when they were gone and steal his wealth. He began to lose sleep at night because he feared that people were plotting to steal his gold. Old friends noticed that he did not sing with the same cheer. He often seemed suspicious when someone stopped in the shop just to chat. Finally, the cobbler visited the banker with a bag of gold in his hands. "Thank you for your generous gift," he began, "but I cannot really afford to be the owner of these gold coins. Please take your money back so that I may again enjoy music, sleep, and my friends. For it seemed that when I buried this treasure, I buried another much more important treasure, my happiness." The cobbler returned the coins and left the shop, and for the first time in days, the people heard his familiar song. Thou shalt not covet. Ironically, the hardest of the commandments to keep, but perhaps the most important one to strive after. Because your true treasure is in your song. And when you sing it with joy and integrity and contentment, everyone will want to gather and listen. That's it. That's all I got. Again, thank you for sticking with me through all of these 10 commandments. It's been a marathon, but it's been a fun one, and I hope an interesting one. And I hope, like me, you've come to see these commandments in a new light. They're not simply ancient tribal laws that reflect a wrathful God, but rather, I like to see them as principles of ancient wisdom that can, when we look at them through a new lens, help to guide us in the unique challenges of our modern world. So next week I'm starting a new series on the 420 laws of Leviticus. No, just kidding. I think we'll go in a different direction for a while. But let me just end with this thought. If you're thinking to yourself, how can I keep all of these 10 commandments straight and all the things that were shared? There's just so much to remember. Jesus actually gives us a little detour around them all. He was once asked, what is the most important commandment? He didn't choose one of the 10. He simply said, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. This is my commandment. Maybe, could it be just as simple as that? Amen.